In the pale, misty light of dawn, 100 Apache warriors stood motionless around the abandoned homestead. Not a whisper stirred the air, not a hoof shifted, not a shadow betrayed movement. It was as if the entire world had paused, holding its breath for a secret buried for more than 2 decades. Among them, Ayani moved with quiet authority, her dark hair streaked with silver threads and braided tightly against her head. She was no longer the small shivering girl she had once been swept from the snowbound valley by a stranger's mercy. She was a warrior, a leader, the embodiment of survival and determination. Ayani had returned to this stretch of open plains for a reason that even the wind seemed to acknowledge. Every step she took toward the center of the circle echoed the weight of memory and duty. The warriors around her held items carefully wrapped in deer-hide objects that had survived the relentless passage of time blankets once used to shield a dying child from frostbite, a chipped water vessel that had quenched parched lip scraps of fabric that had been part of a tiny coat. Each piece carried a story of endurance, sacrifice, and hope, and in their preservation, they bore witness to an act of courage that had altered the fates of many lives. The land itself seemed to lean in as though it remembered the horrors of 23 winters past. Back then, a blizzard had raged for 8 merciless days, leaving families broken, and the living fighting desperately against the cold. Ayani, a girl of barely 12, had been among the first found her lips blue, her breath shallow fever burning through her small frame. A man she would later know as Elias Harper had carried her to safety, choosing her people's survival over his own comforts, and unknowingly over the family waiting for him beyond the snowbound horizon. That fateful choice had reshaped every life it touched, but for Ayani, it became the anchor of her destiny, the event that forged her resilience, her respect for honor, and her understanding of debt owed across generations. Now standing at the center of that cold, quiet circle, Ayani's gaze swept across the vigil she had orchestrated. The silence was ceremonial, almost sacred, yet it thrummed with tension. For the onlookers, if any dared imagine themselves in the story, the question lingered. Why had she returned? Was it vengeance, justice, recognition, or a mixture too complex for words? Her presence alone demanded attention, commanding the respect of every warrior around her. Yet the answer remained shrouded in the early morning fog. She paused for a moment, letting the memories settle around her like the mist on the prairie grass. The snow of that long-ago winter had been merciless, yet it had been a crucible. In the frozen valley, she had learned the fragility of life and the strength required to preserve it. Every choice had consequences that stretched far beyond the individual, shaping the destinies of families, communities, and future generations. It was a lesson that resonated even now in the quiet hush of the dawn, and one that would speak to those who had lived long enough to know the weight of decisions made at the crossroads of conscience and survival. For the audience of men who had weathered their own storms, whose lives were measured in hard-earned years and difficult choices, the scene was intimate and familiar. Honor, responsibility, the courage to act when it is easier to look away. These were values they understood instinctively, and in Ayani's measured movements, the careful arrangement of her people and the artifacts they carried there was an unspoken promise the story that was about to unfold would reveal what it truly meant to hold one's word sacred, to stand for something greater than oneself, and to confront the shadows of the past that refused to be ignored. The wind whispered across the plains, carrying with it the scent of sage and earth as the first rays of sunlight brushed the horizon. The circle tightened imperceptibly, and in that stillness the stage was set. The dawn had come, but it carried with it more than light. It carried the weight of memory, the anticipation of reckoning, and the haunting reminder that some truths cannot remain hidden forever. The winter of 1851 had come with a fury that few could have imagined. The snow fell in sheets so thick and relentless that even the strongest of men and horses struggled to survive. In the heart of the frozen valley, Young Ayani clung to consciousness, her small body trembling under the weight of fever and frostbite. Around her lay her people, 47 souls, men, women, and children alike, scattered like fallen leaves across the white expanse, some barely breathing, others already gone. Their community, once vibrant and full of laughter, was now a tableau of desperation, each life teetering on the edge of annihilation. It was then that Elias Harper appeared, a man whose presence would alter the course of history for this little band. A frontier doctor by training, Harper had traveled many miles with supplies meant for his own family, but the sight of the dying and the cold, helpless children stopped him in his tracks. He could not turn away. Each step he took toward them was measured and deliberate, his hands shaking not from cold, but from the enormity of the choice before him. To save these lives meant abandoning the comfort, safety, and even the family waiting for him back home. The tension between duty to kin and duty to humanity pressed on him like the weight of the storm itself. Ayani watched from the snow, barely able to speak, as Harper began his work. He moved among them methodically, checking fevers, administering willow bark tea, wrapping frostbitten limbs in blankets, and using what little food he had to sustain those who might yet survive. The young girl's eyes followed every action, each gesture imprinting a lesson in courage and sacrifice that she would carry for decades. Harper's hands were raw and chapped, his lips cracked, his breath fogging in the icy air. Yet he gave no thought to his own suffering. Every ounce of energy, every shred of warmth, every last scrap of food was poured into the lives of strangers, into her people, into the ones she would one day call family. The storm raged for 8 days, each longer and colder than the last. Tents built from salvaged cloth and timber trembled in the wind. Fires were tended constantly, smoke curling into the frozen sky, a lifeline against the encroaching frost. Harper kept vigil, moving from one shivering body to another, whispering soft words of comfort, murmuring promises he did not know he could keep. He salvaged every scrap of clothing, every blanket, every medicinal supply, rationing them like gold. The small medallions that Ayani's mother had given her, the tokens meant to protect and to remember, were wrapped carefully in cloth to shield them from the snow. Even the tiny quilt Ayani had once clutched in fear was used to keep another child warm, a symbol of hope passed along from one life to another. But Harper's choice carried consequences. He knew the path he had chosen would cost him dearly. Each hour spent here, saving these lives, was an hour away from his own home, from his wife and child. He had promised his daughter he would be back before Christmas to hang stockings and share warmth by the fire. Instead, he was giving everything he had to strangers, strangers bound to his family by blood he would only understand in the fullness of years. The moral weight pressed down relentlessly: save these children, save their families, or preserve his own life and the life of his loved ones. There was no easy answer. Through it all, Ayani witnessed a courage that transcended fear and sorrow. She saw a man exhausted beyond measure, yet driven by a higher principle, bending the chaos of nature to preserve what was most precious. Every blanket he wrapped, every cup of water he offered, every murmur of reassurance became etched in her memory. She would carry those images into adulthood, shaping her understanding of honor, duty, and the cost of keeping a promise. By the 8th day, 31 lives had been saved, and the remnants of the tribe were strong enough to move to safer ground. Yet the memory of Harper's sacrifice lingered in the snow-laden valley. The blankets, the medallions, the quilted scraps of clothing, all preserved not for himself, but for those he had chosen to save. For Ayani, that winter was no longer simply a season of death. It was the crucible that had forged her, the legacy that would one day bring her and her people back to honor the man who had given everything for the lives of others. The storm showed no mercy. Snow whipped across the valley in jagged sheets, and the wind's howl cut through the tents like a blade. Elias Harper pressed on, moving from one shivering figure to another, his own body battered by cold and fatigue. Hands raw, fingers numb, and lips cracked from frost. He wrapped blankets tightly around children whose teeth chattered uncontrollably. He administered willow bark tea to the fevered, carefully rationed the scant food he had, and ensured the fires never died, knowing that even a moment without warmth could mean the difference between life and death. Each day blurred into the next the relentless blizzard, leaving no respite. The snowdrifts towered around them, blocking paths and hiding dangers beneath deceptive surfaces. Horses whinnied anxiously, their breath forming clouds in the freezing air, but Elias scarcely noticed them, too focused on human lives that depended entirely on his vigilance. Every step was perilous. The ground underfoot could give way to hidden ice, yet he pressed forward, guided by the knowledge that the smallest act, a blanket properly tucked, a sip of water, carefully given, could save a life. Ayani, barely more than a child, watched with wide eyes as Harper moved through the chaos. She saw the toll it took, the exhaustion etched into his face, the blisters on his hands, the tremor in his arms that came not from weakness, but from sheer overexertion. Yet she never heard a complaint, never a whine of regret. He moved as though driven by a force beyond human endurance, each act of care deliberate, each choice weighed with profound responsibility. In her young mind, she began to understand the true cost of courage and the weight of keeping a promise that could not be broken. The nights were the hardest. The temperature plummeted, frosting every breath, every inch of exposed skin. Elias kept vigil at the fires, coaxing the children awake when they drifted too close to unconsciousness, feeding the weak and whispering words of comfort. When one of the elders coughed so violently that his body shook, Harper tore the last remnants of his coat to wrap around the old man. His own body ached, but he did not falter. Each life saved was a victory, but each moment passed carried the bitter knowledge that he had left his own family behind. Throughout it all, Ayani clung to the fragments of memory, the medallions her mother had given her, the quilt she once held so tightly, the blanket that had warmed another child in her place. These objects became symbols of the choices made in the crucible of that frozen valley, and she vowed silently that one day she would honor Harper's sacrifice, repay the debt owed, and carry forward the lessons of courage, duty, and selflessness. By the time the storm began to relent, 31 lives had been preserved, but the price had been monumental. Bodies were stiff faces, pale, and spirits worn, yet hope remained. Harper had chosen the path of moral conviction over personal comfort, a decision that would resonate across generations. The young Ayani, shivering and weak but alive, saw in him a standard to aspire to, a model of integrity and unwavering commitment. For the men watching this story unfold now, the lesson is timeless. There are moments in life when the right choice is also the hardest, when one must place the welfare of others above personal safety or convenience. Elias's journey through the storm demonstrates that courage is not always loud or celebrated. Sometimes it is quiet, methodical, and painful, yet no less heroic. It is a reminder that responsibility, sacrifice, and the integrity to act rightly, especially when it costs everything, define the legacy one leaves behind. 23 years had passed since that merciless winter, and Ayani had grown into the woman the valley had always known. She could become a leader, a strategist, a force of unwavering resolve. She now stood at the edge of the open plains, looking upon the small weathered homestead where Elias Harper had lived out his days in solitude. The land seemed unchanged, yet every gust of wind carried echoes of the past, the whispered memories of a storm of lives saved and of sacrifices silently endured. Behind her, 100 Apache warriors formed a perfect circle, their movements precise, disciplined, and eerily still. Horses shifted slightly in formation, their breath misting in the cold morning air. In their hands, they held artifacts wrapped in deer-hide blankets that had kept children alive, medallions carved with symbols of protection, and the very garments of those who had once teetered on the edge of death. The ceremonial circle was more than a gesture. It was a living testament to the enduring power of loyalty, gratitude, and remembrance. Elias Harper emerged onto the porch, aged by the years. In solitude, his gaze drawn immediately to the figure at the center of the circle. Ayani's presence was commanding yet calm, a quiet authority born of hardship and responsibility. As she stepped forward, she revealed the items she carried: a small bundle, wrapped carefully in worn cloth, containing the blue coat of a child, the medallion he had once pocketed, and other relics that had survived the winter's wrath. The wind tugged at her cloak, but she held her posture firm, every motion deliberate, ceremonial, and respectful. The tension was palpable. Elias felt the weight of decades pressing down a lifetime of guilt and solitude, intersecting with a present both beautiful and terrifying. He had lived with the memory of the lives he could not save of his own family, lost in the very hours he had spent tending others. And now, here was the child he had carried to safety, grown into a woman who bore the full history of that choice in her eyes. The circle of warriors remained motionless, their silence speaking volumes. They had come not for revenge, not for judgment, but to honor what had been endured and to witness the reconciliation of past and present. Ayani's voice, calm but unwavering, broke the hush. She recounted the events of that long-ago winter, how 31 lives had survived because of his tireless efforts, how each survivor had grown to raise children, grandchildren, and even great-grandchildren. Each warrior around her stepped forward in turn, speaking of their lineage of the lives that existed only because of Elias's courage and selflessness. The homestead, once a place of isolation and shame, became a theater of history and humanity, the audience both witness and beneficiary of an act of moral fortitude that had rippled across generations. Every object Ayani presented carried meaning. The medallions were symbols of promises kept. The blankets and clothing were tangible reminders of the countless nights Elias had spent tending, the weak feeding the hungry and warming the cold. They were tokens of survival and gratitude, artifacts that transformed the cold, empty land into a sacred space of remembrance. Through them, Elias understood that the sacrifices he had borne in silence had not been forgotten. They had grown into a legacy far greater than he had imagined, a community thriving because of a single, difficult choice. The cinematic expanse of the plains, the ordered circle of warriors, and the quiet reverence of the morning sun created a tableau that would not soon be forgotten. For Elias, it was the confrontation with his own past, made tangible, a chance to see the consequences of his actions in full. The lives saved, the families forged, and the hope restored. The tension dissolved, not in words, but in acknowledgement, in the solemn nods of warriors, in the measured steps of Ayani, and in the recognition that history had come full circle. For the audience, the moment carried layers of meaning. It was a testament to courage, to honor, and to the enduring consequences of righteous action. It was also a reminder that choices made in moments of extreme adversity can define lives for generations. The story bridged decades, connecting the young girl saved from the snow to the seasoned warrior who now returned to honor him. The lessons of the past resonated in the present integrity, duty, and the weight of promises could outlast even the harshest winters. The ceremony reached its solemn climax as Ayani stepped forward, the morning sun casting a soft glow across the plains. In her hands, she carried a carefully wrapped bundle, the blue coat of a child, a medallion carved with a bear protecting its cubs, and several personal items that had survived the harsh winter decades ago. Each artifact was a symbol not just of survival, but of gratitude, remembrance, and the completion of a circle that had begun so many years before. Slowly and deliberately, she placed them into the hands of Elias Harper, the man whose courage and selflessness had preserved countless lives at the cost of his own family and peace of mind. The circle of Apache warriors around them remained motionless, their silence profound, reverent, and full of meaning. Elias felt the weight of decades lift and settle in a new way. For 23 years, he had lived with the burden of choices made under the cruelest circumstances, believing that his sacrifice had cost him everything. But now, seeing the descendants of the lives he had saved, hearing their voices recount how his actions had shaped families and generations, he realized that nothing he had done was in vain. The medallion and coat were more than tokens. They were the tangible acknowledgement that honor, courage, and commitment to others had created ripples across time, leaving a legacy far greater than he could have imagined. Ayani spoke next, her voice calm but carrying the weight of history. She reminded Elias of the nights he had spent tending the sick, sharing his last provisions, and enduring the bitter cold without complaint. She spoke of the 31 lives saved, of how each survivor had grown to have children, grandchildren, and even great-grandchildren, all standing in strength because of his sacrifice. The warriors nodded in silent agreement, reinforcing the truth-righteous acts performed in times of great adversity carry consequences that outlast the moment, the years, and even individual memory. As the sun climbed higher, illuminating the homestead and the plains beyond, Elias understood fully that honor and integrity mattered more than comfort, safety, or personal gain. The weight of his guilt eased, replaced by a profound sense of peace and purpose. His actions had been difficult, costly, and lonely, yet their impact endured far beyond his own life, shaping communities, securing legacies, and teaching lessons that would be carried forward by those who had once depended on him for survival. The blue coat, once a fragile symbol of survival, now rested against his chest, and the medallion glinted in the morning light. Together, they represented the completion of a promise and the enduring value of courage and selflessness. The circle of warriors slowly dispersed, leaving Elias with the realization that the frontier, vast and indifferent, had finally acknowledged his sacrifice. The quiet respect and ceremonial precision of Ayani and her people spoke louder than words, affirming that choices made for others carry a weight that time cannot diminish. For the audience, the story carries timeless lessons. Honor and keeping promises often require personal sacrifice. Yet those choices shape lives for generations. Acting with courage, compassion, and integrity leaves an enduring mark on families, communities, and history itself. For men who have faced difficult decisions, challenges, or moral dilemmas, this tale resonates deeply. True, courage is quiet, deliberate, and principled, and the value of a life well lived is measured by the good it fosters in others. As Ayani mounted her horse and prepared to depart, she gave Elias a final respectful nod, a gesture of completion and acknowledgement. His eyes lingered on the plains, now alive with both memory and promise. And for the first time in over 2 decades, he felt something that had long eluded him. The serenity that comes from knowing one's choices mattered, from understanding that sacrifice and moral courage create enduring meaning. If the story of Ayani and the Apache warriors has inspired you, follow epic Western stories. Share, like, and comment below to explore more frontier tales rich with emotion, history, and humanity the narration might remind viewers. Remember the values it carries: family honor, responsibility, courage, and the enduring significance of acting rightly even when the cost is great. In this, the frontier teaches timeless lessons. The choices we make define our legacy, and courage and integrity will always echo through the lives of others.